Several environmental groups across Canada are gearing up for what they call their next environmental battle, the federal government's plan to develop a series of new, smaller nuclear reactors to generate power. This week, Natural Resources Canada is expected to unveil what it's calling its roadmap for developing the new reactors. Already, a group of academics and supporters have penned an open letter in support, calling it the initiative a key to fighting climate change, but several environmental and anti-nuclear groups disagree. To discuss it all, I'm joined in the studio by David Schumacher. He signed that open letter in support of the new reactors. And joining me from the foyer of the House of Commons is Green Party leader Elizabeth May. Both of you, welcome. Thanks for joining the discussion.
Thank you, Martin.
Okay, David Schumacher, you have signed this letter. Among the other signatories to the letter, there's former New Brunswick Premier Frank McKenna. There's James Hansen, who's a director of climate science at Columbia University. You're a filmmaker. You've done a film on these. Start us off just by telling Canadians, this is a whole new type of reactor. It's called a small modular reactor. How are these different from what we've seen up until now?
Thanks, Don. Well, I think what's different is that this is kind of a whole new generation of not only nuclear reactors, but sort of the cast of characters that's kind of behind them and sort of the proponents of this. It's not so much major corporations and big, like the usual suspects in the energy play, but it's more, nuclear, let's face it, has become kind of a tough business as far as, building reactors and so forth. And the existing industry, it seems to have really had real problems, and it's not been going particularly well. But I think that that doesn't speak to the technology as much as the business model. And I think there's a lot of young folks that are really eager to solve climate and that are becoming nuclear engineers and working on these smaller reactors they think could be built quickly, more economically in factories, delivered to sites, and by virtue of being smaller, you can address energy needs that are much smaller than a big million-person regular reactor like we have today.
Well, I want to get to Elizabeth May in a second, but safety. I mean, what in terms, because most Canadians, their biggest concern with nuclear is safety.
Right,
safety.
Because we all know nuclear is the most dangerous form of energy, right? Like the meltdowns and everything. Mm-hmm. But if you look at the energy, the deaths per terawatt hour produced, actually coal, everyone would probably believe, is actually the most deaths. But nuclear is the fewest deaths. So it's actually the safest form of energy. Nobody's ever died in Canada or the United States ever from any kind of radiation accident from a nuclear power plant. So it's actually the safest form of energy. And that's part of why I'm on this mission, because we've been lied to. And that's a real problem, because we got to solve climate change, and nuclear is not the enemy here.
Okay, Elizabeth May, you and some other groups had a press conference today. You're getting out in front of this issue. You're opposed to this proposal. Why?
Yeah, first of all, let me just correct a few of the things David said. Nobody has lied to you, but there are different ways of analyzing the effects of existing nuclear power and the deaths it's caused. So, for instance, independent analysis and epidemiological work surrounding Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, after 3 Mile Island, Dr. John Goffman and a number of other eminent scientists did find excess cancer deaths. So it's absolutely the case that we have not had a catastrophic meltdown that kept on going, as it was famously described in China syndrome, wiping out an area the size of the state of Pennsylvania. So nuclear reactors, conventional reactors, carry a very small risk, infinitesimal, of catastrophic impact. But that's not the issue today in terms of why I oppose this. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in its urgent report that we have to act to hold to 1.5 degrees Celsius, made the point that nuclear isn't really part of the solution here. And this is why. We need timely action to move off fossil fuels and to renewable energy as quickly as possible. And in that scenario, nuclear is too expensive, too slow, and unnecessary. So it becomes an expensive diversion. As nuclear reactors in Canada from the get-go have been massively funded by taxpayers for a very small impact on our energy sector, we really need to ensure that we direct our tax dollars where they are most needed, which is in ramping up renewables and improving our east-west electricity grid. Okay, so these small modular reactors are just in the way. Okay,
I want to get to something. Let's look at, I mentioned that Natural Resources Canada is going to be releasing its roadmap this week, later this week. Mm-hmm. David Schumacher, in the draft document, Natural Resources Canada says that these reactors could be ready in, they say 7 to 15 years. Is that a figure that you have been hearing? And is that, I mean, Elizabeth May says this is too slow and too long a time to have any any impact on the attempts to reduce our carbon emissions?
Well, I mean, I think energy is an interesting sector, and just to her point, I take issue with the Harrisburg deaths that she brings up. I think that's sort of controversial, and you're talking about very small numbers. And actually, the IPCC document that she cited says we need a 5-fold increase of nuclear in it in the growth scenario. No, so it's actually calling for an increase in nuclear. But to answer your question, I think that
can they be on stream? Can they come on stream?
Yeah, I mean, well,
fast
think about when did the Manhattan Project happened very quickly, and they were they were working with slide rules. The moonshot happened relatively quickly, and they were working with slide rules. Canada already, France already decarbonized at the rate and scale necessary using 1970s technology, as did Sweden, as did Ontario. So it's already been demonstrated that you can decarbonize with nuclear. It's the only technology that's ever demonstrated it can. Because renewables, you just don't get enough energy from. I mean, it's not grid scale energy. So renewables are great. It's not nuclear versus renewables, but I think it's not that simple to just say, oh, we like wind and solar, so it can do something when it's never happened before.
Elizabeth May, to the point of Natural Resources Canada, we're going to hear from them later in the week, and they're going to say that this technology can be rolled out. Their estimate is between 7 to 15 years. Yeah. Do you believe their figures? And do you believe, David says that renewables are not going to be enough, that the nuclear is part of the formula?
He's mischaracterized the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report entirely, because they specifically say we don't need nuclear to hold to 1.5 degrees, and they develop scenarios that show that you actually can reduce your component of nuclear energy and still hit 1.5. Let me be clear, there's never been an estimate for the building of a reactor in Canada that has come in on time and on budget. But let me just accept the government figures and imagine that 7 to 15 years is when we see this. That's 7 to 15 years too late. We are dealing with a climate emergency. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has told us we have to see dramatic reductions. Essentially, we have to go off fossil fuels entirely by 2050 and be 45% off them by 2030. That's 11 to 12 years from now. So the time frame being proposed by Natural Resources Canada is too late, and it also is a diversion of money and resources we can't afford to divert. Solar and wind are now at grid, at scale in Denmark and Norway. We're seeing storage capacity ramp up, things like holding excess wind power in pumped up gravity-fed reservoirs that you then release when you need it. The battery storage, whether it's through actual batteries or through use of gravity-fed reservoirs that are linked to hydro, this issue has largely been solved. In Canada, we need to solve the problem that our east-west electricity grid doesn't have sufficient interties to get, for instance, Quebec Hydro clean power into the Maritimes to replace fossil fuels. We can do this with renewables, but we need to move fast. And this proposal is a diversionary tactic that is expensive, and we can't afford it.
Okay, I'm going to give the last point to David Schumacher. This report's going to come out this week. Do you think there's enough public support for this, or is there enough public resistance that this could be problematic? We've seen the nuclear industry have a lot of problems in Canada.
Yeah, the industry is not great at communicating, and they're not great at engaging surrogates, and they kick and scream. They're probably not happy I'm here talking to you today, and that's fine, but it's all about keeping it in the ground. We got to keep the fossil fuels in the ground. The sooner we get to that, the better off we're going to be. But I think that this idea of like making a villain out of nuclear and saying it's going to take too long and so on and so forth, I mean, renewables, there's no example of anyone who's ever decarbonized using renewables. That isn't to say that it's not possible, but there are examples of people decarbonizing with nuclear. And if you can make these small modular reactors that you can deploy, especially in people in Canada here who are at energy risk, who are in isolated communities and so forth, that's great. And today I think it's an opportunity for Canadians to really take ownership and feel proud of making a next generation technology that could be disruptive the way an iPhone is, and it could really be like Canada's contribution and stepping up to the plate and leading on climate in a way that the world really needs today.
Okay, David Schumacher and Elizabeth May, I want to thank both of you. Something tells me that this is just the first step in the beginning of a very important conversation. Thanks for speaking with us.
Thanks, Martin.
Thank you, Martin.